Hello Year 10. So today we are going to be analysing Stave 2 Part 1. So please have your English book out in front of you. Write down the title Stave 2 Part 1. You can put Stave 2 Part 1 analysis if you want, and please put the date at the top of the page. Now don't be naughty like me, underline with a ruler. Okay. So that's the first task that I want you to do. Please do that now. Okay, so our key word for the lesson is empathy. Let's make sure we've got that copied down. So empathy means to be understanding, about another person's situations or feelings. Okay, get that meaning copied down, and then your starter task is to answer this question using the word empathy. So think carefully as we read today. How does Dickens create empathy for Scrooge in this stave? So you're going to come back to this at the end. Okay, so I want you to write this sentence starter. Dickens creates empathy for Scrooge by, and you're going to return to that right at the end. Okay, because we're going to look at an extract today. Here we go. Right, so context corner. So you need to grab your highlighter. So I need my blue highlighter. And we need to add another arm onto our spider diagram. Okay. So it was the inspiration for the novel that we're going to be looking at today. So let's give it a little title, Inspiration. So why did Charles Dickens write A Christmas Carol? There's a slide on the PowerPoint you've been sent. You want to boil it down to 3 short bullet points. So Dickens first decided to write a pamphlet which he planned on calling An Appeal to the People of England on behalf of the poor man's child. But in less than a week of thinking about it, he decided instead to put his arguments in a story. Okay, so it began as a pamphlet, a leaflet. It began as an appeal for the poor man's child. Okay, so for people to look after their fellow man and their children. So Dickens set out to write his pamphlet turned book in spring 1843, having just read the government report on child labour in the United Kingdom. So it was inspired, so Christmas Carol was inspired by a government report on child labour. Let's make sure we get that down. The report took the form of a compilation of interviews with children compiled by journalist friends of Dickens that detailed their crushing labours. Okay. So the interviews showed that their work, their labours, was crushing. Okay, bullet point number 2. Dickens read the testimony of girls who sewed dresses for the expanding market of middle-class consumers. They regularly worked 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, rooming, like Martha Cratchit, above the factory floor. He read of 8-year-old children who dragged coal carts through tiny subterranean passages over a standard 11-hour workday. These were not exceptional stories, but ordinary. Dickens wrote to one of the government investigators that the descriptions left him stricken. So children working long hours. So this is an 11 to 16 hour day. and the descriptions and interviews left Dickens stricken. Okay, now for our third bullet point. This new brutal reality of child labour was the result of revolutionary changes in British society. The population of England had grown 64% between Dickens's birth in 1812 and the year of the Child Labour Report. Workers were leaving the countryside to crowd into new manufacturing centres and cities. Work was often repetitive, with children hammering the same nail or gluing the same piece, as an 11-year-old Dickens had to do, hour after hour, day after day. Okay, so child labour is a result of rapidly expanding industry, yeah, and a rapidly growing population. So the boom in child labour due to rapid growth in industry and population. Okay, there you go. So that is your context for this lesson on the inspiration for A Christmas Carol. So that was the report that inspired Dickens. Okay, Year 10, so before we go on to our extract, we need to look at what today's question is going to be relating to the extract. So your question is, to what extent is Scrooge presented as sympathetic in this extract? So you need to pick out your key words. Now, our focus is Scrooge, and to what extent we're sympathetic. So Scrooge and sympathetic are our focuses. So when we are going through the extract and picking out quotes, we want to pick out quotes about Scrooge that make him seem sympathetic. And I would also say to what extent is a really important word, because to what extent tells us that we are having to evaluate. So we aren't meant to fully agree, we're not meant to fully disagree. There are more nuanced responses we can make when we are evaluating, so we can sort of agree and sort of disagree. Okay, so once you've got your keyword, you need to read through your extract. So here's one I prepared earlier. Your extract is from page 21. I've drawn a box around it. So it begins with, "The school is not quite deserted." So what you need to do is you need to grab your highlighter, read through the extract, and pick 3 to 5 quotes that you think are good at answering the question, to what extent is Scrooge presented as a sympathetic character. So I am going to ask you to pause the recording now, and in a different colour to what you annotated with last lesson, can you please pick out 3 to 5 quotes now? Okay, so hopefully here you've got this emotive language. A solitary child neglected by his friends. That adjective solitary and that verb neglected. I think if we're looking at Scrooge being sympathetic and he sobbed, very simplistic language, very emotive language, a very emotive image, really shows us a different side to Scrooge. Okay, and then we've got a lot of description of the setting, of the scenery, and you've got to ask yourself, well, that's a huge chunk of the extract. Is there anything here that could create sympathy? So we've got these focused on human emotions here, but what about here? Is there something other than emotion that could help us understand Scrooge's upbringing and decide whether we feel sympathy for him? So I would pick out words like dull, broken, damp, mossy, ancient, poorly, cold, dreary. And I think here what we're getting is, turn to the side, a semantic field of neglect. So pick out the 3 words from those that you think best fit into the semantic field of neglect. Well done anyone who managed to get those when you were annotating. Okay, moving on. And then we've got the door opening for the ghost and Scrooge. Again, long, bare, melancholy, that triplet of adjectives. And then we've got again emotive imagery. So lonely boy, and then we've got the feeble fire, which is both emotive imagery, and we've got the alliteration that we talked about last lesson. Now I think if you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5, 6, and then a semantic field, that is more than enough. You know, even if you said that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then a semantic field, yeah, absolutely enough. So what we need to do now is we need to plan out in our book how we are going to answer this as an analysis paragraph. Okay, Year 10, so we've annotated our extract, so now we need to think about what are we going to put in the plan for our paragraph. So get the quotes down that you think you want to use. So I'm going to go with, my pen is running out. There we go. A solitary child, neglected. I'm just going to leave it there. I don't think I need the rest of the quote. And he sobbed. Long, bare, melancholy room. And then lonely boy was reading by a feeble fire. Now we've got the semantic field of neglect. So I'm going to go with broken. So many. Damp, mossy, poorly, cold. So if you've got damp in your house, it means it needs to be attended to. Yeah, so there's cold and water getting in, and you need to fix it. So it's not been fixed, so it's damp, it's sort of falling apart. Broken, damp, poorly, cold. And you could also add mossy, so they haven't bothered to clear the moss on that's growing on the building. Okay, so we've got 5 quotes there. We're probably not going to use them all, but it's great to think about what the overall impression is, especially to what extent Scrooge is presented as sympathetic. So we need to think of an umbrella point. So I say so quite a lot, don't I? Anyway, so our point is that Dickens uses Scrooge's physical surroundings to begin. So we don't feel fully sympathetic, so we begin to prompt sympathy for Scrooge. I think that's what connects all of my quote, that he's using this physical setting to try and prompt that sympathy for Scrooge. So go away, pause the video now and write your own umbrella point sentence. Okay, so you've done your umbrella point sentence. You now need to think about writer's message. Okay, and I think Dickens is making a point that actually if you mistreat children or if you ruin someone's childhood, then that will affect them as an adult. Okay, so he's suggesting that we need to, if we want to create kind, empathetic adults, we need to treat their childhood self with kindness and empathy. So children learn to treat others as they're treated. If children are treated with kindness, they will become kind adults. Cool. There we go. So that's what I think the writer's message is. Have a little think for yourself. Write down what you think the writer's message is. Pause now. Okay, and the final thing we're going to do is we're going to think about what's our context, how can we link that? So, Dickens was passionately involved in, speaking up for children's rights. Lots of children working up to 16 hours a day in factories. So, context, Dickens was a passionate his passionate defender of children's rights was inspired by report on child labour in 1843. Okay, and you can add some details about how children worked 16-hour days, etc. He's not using the same image, is he? But he's still making the same point. We have to look after children. Okay, so once you have planned out, right, what are my quotes? You might have put these quotes straight onto your extract. That is absolutely fine. If you don't have an extract, get them down in your book and make sure you annotate them all with what the technique is. Then come up with an umbrella point, what connects your quotes, and then writer's message, context. Okay, so you now need to write up your analysis. So you want to start with an umbrella point. So point. And you want to phrase your point, as I've said in previous lessons, with through the extract, Dickens uses. So we're going to say he uses Scrooge's physical surroundings to begin to prompt sympathy for Scrooge. And then we want to put in some context. So this sympathy was influenced by. Okay, remember when you write up your paragraph, don't do them on separate lines like me. I'm just making it clear to you what needs to go where. So we're going to have our point and then our context. Okay, and then you need your quote. So I'd begin with the semantic field. So Dickens uses semantic field of neglect when he writes, and then give me 3 or 4 quotes. Okay, you then need to talk about the effect, what does the semantic field do, and then zoom in on a word. And then you want to repeat these 2 steps. And right at the end, So you can repeat as many times as you want. You can repeat once, you can repeat twice, you can repeat 4 times. But once you have taken, these 2 steps, okay, quote effect zoom, and you've repeated them a couple of times, then you need to come back to the writer's message. So Dickens, writer's message. Dickens was keen to show this sympathetic side of Scrooge because. Okay, and then link back to what we've said about the writer's message and explain to me, right, what is his bigger message here? So children learning from the way they're treated. So you could even use a quote from Stave 1 here to link to the adult that Scrooge becomes. So if children are treated with kindness, they will become kind adults. But Scrooge was solitary. He was neglected in a melancholy place, and he therefore becomes as solitary as an oyster. We have very specific words repeated. It says Scrooge took his melancholy dinner. So solitary and melancholy are 2 words that we hear from Stave 1. So there's really excellent students, and this is, grade 7 plus here. Not only saying, right, why is Dickens doing it? What's his purpose? But also being able to say, well, we know this is his purpose because in Stave 1 we see the adult that Scrooge has become from this child. And if you can pull together those links between Stave 1 and Stave 2, the examiner is going to be so impressed. Okay, so you need to write me now your paragraph. Follow this format. There is more detail in the PowerPoint if you've got that open. Can you please write this now? Analysis. So let's have a look at this example that the lovely Miss Kynaston has put together for you. So she started with an umbrella point. In the extract, Dickens uses a semantic field of cold and emptiness as well as creating an emotive picture of an isolated child that to some extent presents Scrooge as sympathetic. So what she's done here is she's made an umbrella point, so the semantic field of cold and emptiness, it's emotive, and it to some extent presents Scrooge as sympathetic. But what she's also done is made sure she has addressed fully the question, which is, to what extent is Scrooge presented as sympathetic? And she said, to some extent. Okay, and then we've got context, and the context here has been linked very closely to Dickens's purpose. So you can put this in at the start. Dickens uses this image to critique the neglect of children. Childhood was not always valued in Victorian society, as demonstrated by the fact children were often sent out to work, like Dickens himself, who felt abandoned by his own parents and often depicted vulnerable and poorly treated children. Okay, so that's really clear in 2 sentences, a really clear picture of what's Dickens's purpose and why, what was going on in the Victorian era that made him feel that way. Now, before we go into the quotes, there is a link back to the bigger point. So in my plan, I popped this at the end. Here it's after the context. It says, in Scrooge's case, it clearly shaped the man he became, thus showing how we must care for our fellow man in order to create a better world. You could stick that before your quotes or after your quotes. So you can do it as a kind of introduction to the quotes, or you can do it to conclude the effect of the quotes. It's entirely up to you. Okay, so I just wanted to share that bit with you. Which quotes you chose, which quote you analysed is entirely up to you. My priority is making really perceptive and conceptual arguments at the moment, embedding that context that we're teaching you, and getting to the heart of the writer's purpose. So if you're aiming for a grade 5 and above, you need to make sure that you've made a clear point that shows understanding of the extract. You've linked your point to the context, you've picked 3 interesting quotations, and for each one you've identified a technique or word and given a clear effect. Have you considered the writer's message and used ambitious vocabulary? Now, at the end of every PowerPoint we've been sending you, there is this vocabulary grid. So far, we have had a look at misanthropic, philanthropic, and I will find it. Empathy, there it is, second row, empathy. Okay, so you should be able to use these words. Now, you could absolutely, say Scrooge's treatment as a child, whilst it makes the reader feel empathy, goes some way to explaining his I can't even say the word, misanthropy in adulthood. So try and use these words as much as you can. If you do use them and you want to draw your teacher's attention to it, then just highlight those words in your paragraph. We would love to see that. Okay, so if you're aiming for a grade 7 or above, you need to make an umbrella point that identifies patterns in language like the semantic field we discussed and uses academic verbs to be specific about Dickens's message. You need to consider what Dickens is trying to tell us about Victorian society, so don't just link your point to context saying this was going on. Actually say, well, this is what was going on and Dickens felt this way, so the text is designed to make us feel this way about it. Embed apt quotations, so appropriate quotations to answer the question and to back up your point. Analyze imagery and a range of devices, so lots of different techniques and zooms. Evaluate the message, so think about it from both sides. And again, use ambitious vocabulary. Okay, Year 10, so the last thing for you to do is to go back to that starter and complete that sentence now explaining how or why Dickens creates empathy for Scrooge. Once you're finished, take a photo of your work, send it to your English teacher. Well done, we're really proud of you. Bye-bye.